So this is a new episode of Building the Open Web presented by Nir. I'm Sasha, and today we have Danny Zuckerman, who runs Threebox. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sasha.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with your background. Where did you grow up?
Yep, I grew up out in the Bay Area. So I grew up a little bit south of San Francisco in Menlo Park and was there for about 25 years before moving out here to New York.
Well, were you exposed to entrepreneurship community or technology ever since you were growing up, essentially?
I was a bit. I wasn't, part of it directly as I was growing up. I was always kind of an entrepreneur in my own way. My first job, I started a baseball camp, I think my freshman year of high school, because I wanted to do my own thing. And I've always been in and around the tech scene, interested in the latest that was coming out from, at that time, it was Yahoo and Google. And so always plugged in a little bit, but wasn't working in tech right away.
hmm And so, how did you decide to go to Stanford? What did you study there? What was your passions at the time?
Yeah, so my passion at the time was sports. Basically, my whole life was sports through high school. And I hadn't planned to go to Stanford. I grew up about 5 minutes off campus, so was at their campus quite a bit. But I wanted to go away to college. I looked at a whole bunch of schools on the East Coast. But when the time came and I went and checked out Stanford as a potential student, I just fell in love with it. There were a whole bunch of people on campus over the few weeks that I was visiting and thinking about my decision, and met amazing people at their admit weekend and just couldn't pass up the opportunity. So had some conversation with my parents to make sure that even though I was 5 minutes away, they treated like I was away at school, and the rest was fantastic.
Nice. That's awesome. And how did you get interested and involved in tech afterwards?
Yeah. So when I was at Stanford, I hopped around to a few different majors, but I landed on political philosophy, which might sound like it was very far away from tech, but it kind of grounded my thinking in how people coordinate and organize, whether that's at the scale of societies or at the scale of small teams. And I kept that going a little bit in my first job after school, where I was at Bain, working with a bunch of large, mostly tech companies, thinking through their strategy, both in terms of product roadmap, but also organization. And after a couple of years, decided I wanted to be much closer to the building of these new technologies. And so looked around at some various options, and had been working for one client in the education space and just saw how much opportunity there was to make an impact, especially with technology. It was still pretty early in ed tech, and no one was doing it really well. And met a company called CERN, which at the time was about 10 people, an early nonprofit education technology startup that was really trying to build tools for the classroom that were really helpful to teachers, and fell in love with that vision and moved out to New York to be their first product manager.
Interesting. And so, what was the learnings there? In this company, sounds like you joined fairly early and was focusing on the product side of the house, right, on user engagement and things like that.
Yeah. So my favorite thing there was building the team and seeing how the organization changed over time. Again, like starting with political philosophy, I just found it fascinating to see how sometimes hard, but also sometimes magical it was to get a group of different people working together. The hardest lesson, though, early on is just how much harder it is to build the product you set out to and build the impact you set out to than it seems when you're strategizing, whether that's at a startup or a consultancy. It's really easy to think about how things should happen and think about how things should be implemented. But we were building basically digital math lessons for 3 to 10-year-old kids, and you would design a new product that was supposed to teach them multiplication. And then you'd go take it and test it with them, and they'd have absolutely no idea where to click on the screen. They'd have no clue what was going on. And so the first lesson is that things are not going to work out as you expect them to. And so to really quickly get to a hypothesis and a prototype of that hypothesis, and then take it to your users and let them show you what they really need and what they really get and don't. And just that need for constant iteration and constantly questioning what you think you know right now to get to something better next.
hmm And how did you make transition to both blockchain space, Web3 space, and also more away from the now that you learned the product side of things, you moved into more like strategy and operations?
Yeah, so everybody who came into blockchain has their own version of when they fell down the rabbit hole. Mine actually, I fell down two rabbit holes at once. And so it was about 2015, 16. And again, I'd always been really interested in how people coordinate. I hadn't actually looked into blockchain all that much. I had left San Francisco a couple of years before because I had gotten honestly a little bit overwhelmed by just how tech focused it was and overwhelming. And Bitcoin and blockchain kind of at the surface seemed like that to me. But when I left CERN, I dove into blockchain and really learned about it for the first time. And it just hooked me with being the best coordination tool we've ever had. The ability to spin up a network towards a goal, whether that's around resources or around a community, and get incentivize a whole bunch of people to work together, a whole bunch of resources to work together towards that. We've never had a tool better than that for large scale coordination. And so went very quickly down that rabbit hole simultaneously and completely separately. I was falling down the identity rabbit hole. And that was my mom was a professor and I had studied identity. She worked in sociology. And in 2011, she had a stroke that knocked out a lot of her capabilities and her speech, and really stole a lot of her identity. And in her recovery, she was doing a lot of thinking about not just the physical rehab and that journey, but also the emotional journey of trying to figure out what she was going to do next and who she was now. And she wanted to write a book about her experience and the experience of others who were going through similar things, and traumas that really took away their jobs and other pieces of their identity. But she couldn't write now. Speech was still pretty difficult. And so I became basically her voice and co author on a book about, again, completely separate from tech, but the role that identity plays in our lives and how we often think about it and the misconceptions around it. And it just so happened that those two rabbit holes, blockchain and identity, come together in really important ways. And so that kind of led me to jump into the space with Uport.
Got it. I see. And how did writing the book essentially informed the next couple of years for you, Uport, and then starting your own company?
Yeah. So when we think about identity, we often think of it as a single static individual thing. There's this idea that we each have this one true core self that we need to find or live up to, and that there is this constant identity that we have, and that just isn't true. That's not how identity works. And if you look at this from the perspective of sociology or philosophy or psychology, but also if you look at it from the perspective of how tech should work, identity is much more dynamic and it's much more about relationships than most people realize when they think of it as an individual thing. And we don't just have one single identity, we have many, and those all interplay together. And we are truly different people when we're at work versus with friends, and we're different people today than we were 10 years ago or that we will be 10 years from now. And so as I was exploring the blockchain space, I saw some really exciting things about how new approaches to identity, in particular self-sovereign identity, could really fix some of the issues of the old internet. But I also saw a bunch of approaches that I felt like were way too rigid in their approach, and way too reliant on a user having their one private key that was going to be their anchor through everything. And that is kind of just transposing some of the same issues that we have in the physical world onto the digital world. And so what I wanted to bring to the space was this perspective that I had learned in writing the book and thinking about human coordination of actually identity needs to be thought of as a much more dynamic thing and a much more interpersonal thing. And if we don't build that perspective into the way that we design identity systems as we build Web3, then we're just not going to have the foundation that really aligns with how people interact. And if our goal is to build a digital society that's much better on Web3, we need to think about how people really interact.
Hmm. And when you started on this journey, like how did you approach getting initial customers? Like, who was the customer even in the first place?
Yeah, so when I first started, I was with Uport. And at Uport, I met Michael Senna and Joel Thordenson, who are my co-founders at Threebox, and we basically all shared this vision of a much more flexible and dynamic system than existed at the time. And we also really believed that the way that we are going to make any better system come alive was through solving real, not just theoretical needs and designing a better system, but solving real pain points for people building in the space. And so the first thing we did when we started Threebox is we went out and talked to a dozen developers about some of the ideas we had to give users control of their identity and data, and figured out what the biggest issue that they were missing right now was. And over we heard we are building apps that are relying on hex addresses to identify users. And that's not an okay experience. No users are ever going to use that. But to do anything more than that, you either at the time had to use a server to store profile information and photos and names, or you had to put that information on chain, which compromises privacy, or you had to build in-house a super complicated IPFS-based solution. And none of those worked. And so people just weren't doing it. And so once we heard that enough, we said, okay, we actually know a bunch about identity, and we had helped spec the decentralized identifier spec at the Decentralized Identity Foundation. We were at Uport. We had been following IPFS really closely, and we put those two together into a really simple prototype that let developers build profiles and other data into their Ethereum applications without having to change much. And we knew that that was going to be attractive to people because we had spent the time talking to them before we even built it.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And fast forward to today, like what do you think changed in the industry since you started in those initial conversations and where we are today?
Yeah. So, two things that we heard quite a bit when we first got started. One is, why do I want to have any personal information attached to my Ethereum address? Crypto is supposed to be all about anonymity. And fast forward today, and that's just not the case. People are trying to build much more sophisticated applications and see a lot more use for composable services, whether DeFi or otherwise, as opposed to thinking of crypto just as this anonymous cryptocurrency network. And so we don't hear that nearly as much anymore. People really understand the value of interoperable data and identities. The other thing at the time, people were still trying to put a lot of information on chain. And we had to convince a lot of people, actually, it's much better to put most data off chain, that you actually don't want a lot of your personal information or browsing history to be immutable or expensive for that matter. And you don't need global consensus on it. And so we should be using blockchains for a few things, but not most things. And so building other interoperable systems that can complement blockchains.
Yep. And what are the use cases that you're seeing the most prevalent so far?
Yeah. So there's a few that are definitely the most common. So one is basically cloud backup and sync. And so if you have MetaMask, and before 3 bucks, you might have a token watch list and preferences and a contact list and your various settings. That was all stored locally. And if you cleared your cache, or if you got a new computer or just started using a different browser, all of that was lost. And so with 3 bucks, MetaMask can basically do encrypted backup and sync. And so they put all of those preferences and settings and contact lists into your 3 bucks. And so that data is now portable across your different devices and your different browsers. Pretty soon we'll have a mobile implementation. And so if you have MetaMask with mobile wallet, you can access the same contact list there. But more exciting, because it's being stored with you as a user and associated to your key. If you change wallets or start to use Rainbow, for example, Rainbow can then request access to that same data and build off that same contact list. And so this basic cloud backup and sync functionality is one of the most common use cases. The other one that's really taking off recently is another kind of data that's really important in applications is data between two people. So messages and chat. And we have a feature called Threads, which is basically any feed of information or content between multiple people. And so now you can have completely peer-to-peer encrypted private messages on dApps, or you can have public comments that are anchored to either a site or to an NFT or to any object. And so pretty soon, Augur will be coming out with V2, and that will include comments on each prediction market. And so no matter what interface you're using, you can still have the same set of comments about any given market and have that global chat into that composable data alongside the composable smart contracts.
Got it. Interesting. And I assume it will be enabled by you.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. That's super interesting. So if we go to overall, maybe like to the internet as a whole, from your perspective, what are the main issues today with the internet built around silos? Why do you think that's an issue?
Yeah, so the way that the internet works today, if you're starting a company or building a product, is you really have to build your own stack from the ground up. And This costs companies quite a bit. They're rebuilding a lot of things that have been built elsewhere, and so it's costly. It's also creating pretty sprawling risks in trying to manage data across lots of different systems, and lots of failure risks as you try to maintain all the connections. But it's particularly painful for developers who, instead of being able to jump straight to their value add, have to recreate things that have been built elsewhere or manage all of this complexity. And I think it's telling to look at two of the biggest movements in the tech world today. One of them is data privacy. And so, whether it's regulation or multi billion dollar companies who are trying to basically reinforce and secure data silos because there's so much breaching of information and so much difficulty and liability around securing data. And so, that whole movement is around making the silos more isolated and more protected. But then on the other hand, you have the API economy and serverless and Jamstack, which is really trying to make it more possible for developers to connect microservices and data and information across these many different silos and integrate experiences across sites. And so simultaneously, there's the need to really protect the data in each of these silos, which is really hard because you have to recreate it for each one, and to design systems that cross over between these silos. And neither of those scales in the current system. And what we really need is a protocol that lets us connect all of the different users and databases and microservices and applications that are interacting online in a way that's inherently secure and also interoperable.
Hmm. And when you think at like where we are today, do you think like we're like very early in this, or we are getting to the place where like mass adoption will be happening at some point soon?
I think it's going to happen in waves. So I don't think that a year and a half from now we'll be looking around and the entire internet will have changed and big corporations will be building on shared networks instead of their own servers. But I do think that there are some elements beyond the blockchain space that are ready to adopt some of this today. And so we often talk about Web3 as mostly centered around blockchain, but there's also a broader distributed web and a lot of really exciting applications building peer-to-peer collaboration or messaging, or more and more applications and products that have privacy built in from the ground up. And right now they're doing that by storing everything on users' devices locally and not having backup anywhere. And so I think they're ready to embrace this system that lets them have the convenience and interoperability that people expect in a cloud world, but also the privacy. And I also think shortly after that, there's no and low code platforms that can now give the people building on them much more powerful tools around data and services if they can plug into a more interoperable web that don't require hosting a backend. And so there's lots of builders out there that are ready for some of these tools, and I think we'll start to see adoption pretty soon.
Hmm. And also the space, like whether it's Web3 or P2P, is often criticized for like inability to capture value. So how do you think about monetization models and the evolution of it?
Yeah, I think we're very early in that journey, and I think we haven't seen the best models. The I'm a huge believer in tokens. I think the ability to program incentives into a network and align it are incredibly powerful. I think we've seen a lot of token models that don't work, and we're going to continue to see a lot of experimentation with some that do. I think that what they're really going to let networks do is allocate value capture much closer to value creation. And so huge rent extraction is probably going to not completely disappear, but be less. But as we get better and better at tracking the flow of information and value through a system and designing tokens that appropriately mirror that, you're going to catalyze a bunch of really rapid development from lots of different areas. And I think that as you have lots of people contributing to a network and lots of value flowing in, the people who created the foundations are going to be able to be rewarded for that.
Hmm. And so, how do we increase amount of experimentation on that front? Sounds like I agree with you. Sounds like what you're saying is that there are a lot of models that didn't make sense from the token perspective, but we want to get to the place where people will be experimenting a lot and get to the place where there are models that make sense becomes then part of the general awareness and people can understand them a lot better. So, like, what is missing today?
Yeah, so I think there's a few pieces. One is tools to be able to test tokens in more real world ways. And so I think the team at Common Stack is building great tools for that with CAD. And I think we're seeing new models that separate out the long term governance over a network from the initial implementation so that there's more room for some iteration after the first design. I also think that it's a little bit about the product mindset that teams take to how they build a token. And so early on, we saw a lot of tokens that were designed and launched before there was a network or even a product ready to work with it. And that assumes that you know how the network's going to operate and assumes you know where the value is and you know what the stakeholders want. And I think the first thing that every product manager learns is you actually don't know until you go out and put something in people's hands. You've got a whole bunch of things wrong. And so I don't like the idea of using a token to bootstrap a network because then you jump past that early stage where you have to be iterating to find out what's valuable. I think what we need to be doing is building products and building networks and getting to some level of whether it's product or protocol or service network fit, because then you have your early adopters who are there just because they find what you've built useful, and they're going to give you not just usage but feedback and help you iterate and get to the next set of customers. And I think it's once you get to that early adoption and that early product market fit, then a token can help you accelerate growth and incentivize the network and maybe help you cross the chasm. But if you introduce it before that, then you're just going to drown out all of your early adopters with speculators and not be able to iterate to get to something that's meaningful.
So it sounds like what you're saying, like people were not this kind of stuff requires like a lot of like prototyping and figuring out things before deploying, and people kind of like jumped ahead with deploying some like token models that they thought make sense, and then product network was not even attached to it, and kind of the sequence of events was not correct, what you're saying, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's going to be different for different types of networks and tokens. Some that are meant to incentivize resources like Filecoin maybe don't require quite as much experimentation as a network that's about coordinating people because people don't respond to purely economic incentives. And so I don't think it's going to be a one size fits all approach. I think different teams are going to have to find different ways to figure out what the right fit is.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, how do you think about the kind of like ecosystem of product builders, engineers, talent overall? Like, which talent do you think we're missing in Web3 space today?
Yeah. So first thing I'd say is I think it's the best collection of talent I've ever seen, and that's of course engineering talent um, and a lot of great product talent as well, and token design talent and all of that. But also just the breadth of thinking in the space is overwhelming, and that's what I've most enjoyed since getting into it. Is you don't have people who put their heads down and think about the technical problem in front of them and ignoring kind of all of the other aspects. Everyone's thinking about the mechanism design and the game theory and the economic systems that we're all trying to build and improve. I think that the biggest thing we're missing is product thinking. And whether that comes from product managers that come from more traditional tech or just learning from the approaches that have worked in the last wave of the internet and adopting those in the current ecosystem. I really think the mindset of let's test our hypothesis, get something out there, get initial usage, and really look at traction, even if there's not a huge market today, even if there's still not that many users. Let's get a sense of whether people are finding what we're doing valuable before we double down on it, is really the approach we need. And that's how we're going to get collectively to things that serve much bigger and bigger needs and use cases on the internet.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think product builders and engineers should love the space?
Because you can build things that simply weren't possible before. The tools that we have in Web3, of course they build on everything else that's been built previously, but whether they're economic tools or interoperable data, like if you can think about it these days, you can pretty much build it or at least build an early version of it. And so the ability to compose assets or to compose data or to draw on the amount of open source products that are out there being built every day, it just lets you move so much faster. And stacking on the Legos lets you do so much more in the long run than you can do in Web 2.
Mm-hmm. And seems like you seem to think that it will start with developers, right? Because, like, for example, like my personal experience was talking to my friends who are not developers and kind of like understanding, like, what do you think about user-centric web? Sometimes it's like very lukewarm responses, like, well, I have everything I need. There's Instagram, and there is like some other app that they use on the phone that exists, and like, like who would essentially bring those value out to the users, and how would users see the value? Is it about them, or is it about developers actually experimenting, coming up with like 1,000 applications and a couple of them stick?
I really think that it's going to be developers that bring this to the mainstream. I don't know that users will ever be aware that they're using a Web3 app or a blockchain app. I don't think that they need to. And certainly that's not why they're going to adopt something. But I think it's the new technologies that are being developed at the base layers gives the developers of services and applications more tools. And so they can build new things that weren't possible before. And so that's where I think adoption is really going to come from is a huge inflow of developers that see the power of these new technologies and this new medium and the new ability to take assets and data and experiences across different networks and to do completely new things with them. They're going to build products that we couldn't have dreamed of before, and that's what's going to attract the users eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm on the same page. I actually think that the design space of use cases will like dramatically expand soon if transaction cost goes down dramatically, usability improves, so you can actually compete for like mass market, those things. And if developer tooling actually improves, then you can actually have a lot more experimentation, but also a lot more use cases that haven't been explored in the last 3-4 years.
Completely agree. Yeah.
I was wondering also, so what are the trends you are seeing overall among your user base? Do you see any particular geographies adopting first, or any particular personas, or like what are some of the learnings on that front?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. So most of our users are still in the US or Western Europe. But I think that's where our team is. And so that's been a part of that. We have more and more developers in our community that are coming from various parts of Asia in particular and from Australia. And so I do feel like it's pretty global in terms of the development of applications. The biggest trends I've seen are people trying to build pretty complete applications. And so I think for a while at the end of last year, a lot of what we were seeing were pretty thin layers on top of a smart contract or new ways to wrap DAI and send it to another address or arbitrage something in DeFi. But we've started to see a bunch of applications in the last few months that actually have a market picked out. And even if it's not a super complete experience yet, they've enabled something new for users. And so I'll give a couple of examples to bring that to life. Me Token has built a way for anybody to launch their own token that represents their own time and to put that on a bonding curve and sell it. But they haven't just made it kind of a token contract and factory. They've built a really nice site and experience to help you not just launch it, but manage it and see the people who have bought into your token and interact with them. Another one's micro sponsors, and they've created a marketplace for app developers and content sites to create areas for sponsorship on their site and to basically create an NFT around a certain amount of time on a certain placement on your site to advertise to your audience. And that can be sold to a set of advertisers who are interested in the crypto audience. And again, a fairly small market to start, but it's a complete experience that's thought through all sides of all of the users. And so I think actually has a chance to start to gain some traction, figure out what people are really excited about within that product experience and double down on it.
Mm-hmm. How do you also think about reputation? How does reputation is connected to identity? How would it evolve?
So reputation is such a loaded term, almost as much as identity is. And reputation really needs to be contextual. My rating on eBay tells you nothing about how trustworthy a driver I am, and it tells you very little about my history of paying back loans or how good an employee I'm going to be. And so the way that we think about it is it's really powerful to have portability of data that makes up your reputation. And so if I can accumulate all of the different transactions I've had and all of the different interactions I've had on Uber or on Foam or on any of these other experiences, then those pieces of data can become the primitives to run a reputation algorithm on top of it. But the idea of a universal reputation algorithm just doesn't make any sense, because every network and platform and application needs to think about what actually matters for the users of this particular experience and design whatever reputation system they're going to have around that experience. And so in some cases, just having a name and a profile might be enough. If you've got a relatively small community, everyone's keeping track of who says what, and you don't need a formal reputation system. You just need a way for people to keep track in their head. And as you get bigger and bigger, you might need badges, and at a certain size, you need to move to a numeric score that makes sense and considers the factors that matter for your platform. And so, the way that we think about it is users need to have the various pieces of data from all different experiences that can be leveraged into a reputation, but the reputation itself needs to be specific to the context that they're in.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That makes sense. And do you think that there will be some Web2 companies, like traditional consumer internet companies or other types of tech companies, that will be willing to open up their ecosystem and seeing that reputation outside might be more valuable? Or do you think they'll be more kind of protective of their own data?
So I think for a while they'll probably be protective of their own data, especially some of the companies who have really done like made their business around really effective trust models. So one example would be Airbnb. Airbnb put a ton of work into making it possible for strangers to trust each other in their own homes. And they actually probably need to keep a relatively closed system for that, because as soon as they open it up, they have less control, and that means it can be abused or gamed. And as soon as their trust disappears, then their entire business disappears. It's so reliant on that. But I think you've already seen some other companies who have different models take steps that you could see them start to open up their forms of reputation. And so Twitter would be an example. And it's a very different kind of reputation, but the influence and the number of followers and the weight of their tweets in any given feed, all of those things are to Twitter reputation. And as they explore more open protocols for global conversation and making Twitter just one client and one service provider among that, I think they'd be very well served to open up what they've accumulated on their system to others developing at the base layer.
Yep. And can you maybe talk a little bit about your most recent announcement with 3ID Connect?
So to date, ThreeBox has been a way to connect an Ethereum key to a 3ID, which is our decentralized identifier, and basically the middleware that lets users control various resources, including databases. And for us, that's OrbitDB databases. And so you have Ethereum key, it maps to your 3ID, and that maps to your data, some of which is public, some of which is encrypted. And we've always worked mostly through existing wallets like MetaMask, or Portis or Wallet Connect. But we've always had a much more modular vision in mind. And we want users and developers to be able to connect a whole bunch of different keys to that same 3ID, because users aren't going to just have one Ethereum key as they interact online. You might have multiple Ethereum keys, you might have near keys and Arweave keys and flow keys. And so what 3ID Connect starts to let us do is authenticate multiple different keys from multiple different chains and multiple different wallets to the same 3ID. And that lets users take their ID and all of the data associated with their ID across all of their different experiences. And so instead of recreating a new profile and a new set of social connections and a new contact list, instead that now flows seamlessly across all of these different blockchains and apps, no matter what wallet you're using.
Wow, that's solid. And how do you see that one evolving overall?
Yeah, so 3ID Connect, what we just released is the first version of that. And right now it's optional. We'll pretty soon be making that required for everybody that's built on ThreeBox and migrating to that fully. But that's really part of a much bigger shift. And so we released about a month ago Ceramic, which is our protocol that really takes what we've done at Threebox for Ethereum and data, and making it interoperable. And Ceramic really extends that to not just Ethereum and not just data, but really any network and any blockchain and any resource. And so with ThreeID Connect, it's kind of the first step to start associating more different types of keys to users' identities, and enables this much more chain agnostic vision that we're moving towards with Ceramic.
Yep. And for people who want to learn more about you or for Threebox, what would be the best place to go on the internet?
Yeah, so check out our website, threebox.io. And then we're always in our Discord community. Basically, everything we do happens there. That's chat.threebox.io. And then if you want to find me, I'm Dazuck, Dazuck on Twitter, and I believe my DMs are open.
Cool. I see. And what would be your parting message to the audience?
I think just basically anything you can think of is buildable now. There's types of experiences that were just completely impossible a few years ago. But with the speed of what people are building in the blockchain ecosystem and in the Web3 ecosystem more broadly, it's basically possible to piece together any set of experiences that you have seen online into a much more interoperable, holistic experience. And whether that's through some of the app building platforms that are gaining steam. Dap Hero is one that we're really excited about, through, of course, assets and NFTs on blockchains, but also through composable data. You can start to design things that maybe aren't complete yet, but show the future, and I think are going to come very fast. And so if you're curious about it, to just start building, and if you can think about it, start poking around and find ways to build it, because it's probably possible.
That's awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Danny.
Thanks, Sasha. This was fun.
Hey, so thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go to market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.